Hi, these are the most interesting historical photos that I could find. Let's go! In 1956, Thomas Fitzpatrick landed a small plane on a narrow Manhattan street right outside the bar where he had been drinking. In 1958, he did it again because one man said the first landing never happened. Sergei Krikalev went to space as a Soviet cosmonaut, but in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed while he was still aboard the Mir station. He came home in 1992 after 311 days and landed in a country with a new name, a new flag, and a broken old system. In 1983, one rare frame caught three aviation icons at once: a NASA shuttle on a modified 747 while Concorde crossed the sky behind it. The shuttle era ended in 2011, Concorde stopped flying in 2003, and this exact view is part of history. Ham sits strapped into his capsule before the Mercury Redstone 2 flight on January 31, 1961. He survived the 16-minute mission, which reached about 253 kilometers and helped clear the way for the first American human spaceflight later that year. On October 1, 1939, Soviet and Japanese representatives posed together during the armistice after the Battle of Khalkhin Gol. The clash lasted from May to September 1939 and ended in a Soviet-Mongolian victory that changed Japan's next moves in Asia. In 1945, the B-17G Wee Willie was caught in a rare mid-air photo over Stendal, Germany, just as the bomber began to break apart. Of the 9 men on board, only the pilot survived. In 1914, Ernest Shackleton sailed on Endurance to cross Antarctica, but the ship never even reached land before the frozen sea locked it in place. The ice-trapped Endurance in January 1915 sank it in November 1915, and all 28 men survived. In 1903, people in Manitoba gathered around a lake sturgeon so large it weighed 184 kilograms and measured more than many of the boys beside it. Lake sturgeon can live for more than 100 years. In the 1880s, miners at the Randall Mine in New Almaden, California, rode underground in a cramped 2-level cage with barely any space to move. New Almaden became one of the most important mercury mining centers in the American West. In October 1962, Americans gathered around television sets as John Fitzgerald Kennedy announced a quarantine of Cuba during the Cuban crisis. The crisis lasted 13 days, and by October 28, 1962, the Soviet Union agreed to remove its launch sites from Cuba. During a 1950 costume test for All About Eve, the actress posed as Miss Caswell in one of her earliest film images of the decade. The role was small, but the film won 6 Academy Awards and marked one of her first steps toward worldwide fame. On November 7, 1935, Germany staged a mass oath ceremony at the Feldherrnhalle for some of its first conscripts since 1918. The return of compulsory military service had been announced in March 1935. In August 1923, children at Jefferson School lined up for a pie-eating contest with their hands kept off the table. Under an outdoor basketball hoop, they had to finish the pies by face alone. In 1945, Soviet school children gave the United States ambassador in Moscow a carved Great Seal of the United States as a gift of friendship. It hung in his office for 7 years before a hidden listening device was found inside it. In 1721, Russia tested a wooden submarine near St. Petersburg in front of Peter the Great. The craft was designed by Yefim Nikonov and is remembered as the first submarine project built for the Russian state. In May 1990, Mikhail Kalashnikov and Eugene Stoner posed together holding the designs that made them famous on opposite sides of the Cold War. Kalashnikov created the AK-47, while Stoner designed the AR-15 and M16 family, putting 2 rival weapons inventors in one frame. Around 1982, this giant Soviet project, 941, a Kula submarine, likely TK-202, stood inside a shipyard like a black steel wall. The class was about 172 meters long and became the largest submarine design ever built. In 1949, Henri Matisse worked from bed in his room at the Hotel Regina in Simiez, using a long pole to sketch chapel designs on walls matched to the real space. Those studies became the Chapel of the Rosary in Vence. In 1950, United States Marine Captain Ike Fenton was photographed just after hearing reports that his unit in Korea was nearly out of ammunition. The image comes from the Chosin Reservoir campaign, where troops operated in temperatures near -30 degrees Celsius. In 1976, a Polish woman stood at the Catton Memorial in London holding the portrait of the husband she lost, making one family's grief impossible to ignore. Starobielsk was one of 3 main Soviet prison camps tied to the 1940 deaths of captured Polish officers. On February 23, 1945, an American soldier carried a Filipino girl through the ruins of Manila. The Battle of Manila lasted until March 3, 1945, and left much of the city, March 1945, and left much of the city destroyed. On June 6, 1944, a United States medical officer bandaged an injured soldier on the Normandy beachhead during the D-Day landings. More than 156,000 Allied troops reached the coast that day. James H. Howard became an ace with the Flying Tigers and later added 6 more victories with the United States Army Air Forces. He remains the only fighter pilot in Europe to receive the Medal of Honor. In 1924, a New York shoeshine boy carried his whole business in a wooden box strapped to his arm. Back then, shoeshining was street work done for small coins, often by boys this young. In July 1944, German troops taken by the Red Army were marched through Moscow in a huge public display. About 57,000 men were led through the city in what became known as the Parade of the Vanquished. In 1946, girls in an acrobatics class at Herbert Hoover High School in San Diego built a human pyramid on the grass. The formation rose 4 levels high with no mats and no visible safety gear. During Operation Market Garden in September 1944, the sky over the Netherlands filled with Allied paratroopers in one of the largest airborne drops ever made. More than 34,000 airborne troops took part, but the operation failed to hold the last bridge at Arnhem. On December 31, 1999, Boris Yeltsin resigned on live television and handed power to Vladimir Putin as acting president. The broadcast ended one era of post-Soviet Russia in a single speech watched on New Year's Eve. After being seized in Argentina on May 11, 1960, Adolf Eichmann was brought to Israel to stand trial. He sat inside a bulletproof glass booth during the 1961 court proceedings, creating one of the most recognized images of the case. On December 26, 1973, Richard Nixon flew on United Airlines Flight 55, becoming the only sitting United States president ever to use a regular commercial flight. The aircraft used the call sign Executive One, and the trip was meant to show fuel saving during the energy crisis. On May 5, 1945, United States troops entered Mauthausen and found prisoners crowding the gates as the camp system collapsed. The banner above them says, "Spanish anti-fascists welcome the liberating forces," fixing the exact moment the site changed forever. On May 9, 1945, Moscow lit the sky above the Kremlin with the Victory Salute. The celebration used 1,000 guns firing 30 volleys to mark the Soviet victory in Europe. On the 28th of June, 1880, Ned Kelly appeared at Glenrowan in homemade iron armor that turned him into one of the strangest figures in outlaw history. The suit weighed about 44 kilograms, and this was the last stand of the Kelly gang. On October 17, 1933, Albert Einstein arrived in the United States after leaving Germany and soon settled in Princeton. He joined the Institute for Advanced Study, became a United States citizen in 1940, and never lived in Europe again. On June 13, 1942, a New York parade float rolled down Fifth Avenue with Hitler shown as a skeletal figure. It appeared in a war bond parade less than 6 months after the United States entered World War II. On April 22, 1945, Soviet troops reached Sachsenhausen and found only about 3,400 prisoners still inside the camp. About 33,000 had been forced out the day before, and thousands never returned. In 1983, 106 million Americans watched the final episode of MASH, making it the most watched television broadcast in United States history at the time. The Korean War lasted 3 years, but the series stayed on air for 11 years. In 1949, Lucky Lady 2 began the first non-stop flight around the world and stayed in the air for 94 hours. The aircraft completed 4 mid-air refuelings before landing back in Texas. In 1924, residents of Petrograd crossed flooded streets by boat during one of the city's worst floods. The water swallowed whole roads and pushed daily life onto improvised boats like these. Between 1920 and 1923, orphaned children from famine regions lined up for haircuts beside rail cars before relocation. The crisis moved huge numbers of children through stations like this, turning travel points into temporary shelters. Rare photos from the 1970s and 1980s show women coal miners in Appalachia posing after work in helmets, overalls, and lamp gear. In a job long dominated by men, images like this were still uncommon in those years. On January 9, 1936, the United States Army adopted John C. Garand's M1 as its new standard service rifle. It was the first semi-automatic rifle issued as standard by a major army, and more than 5 million were built. On October 24, 1938, new federal rules in the United States began shutting children out of factory work that had once relied on boys and girls this young. The Fair Labor Standards Act set national age limits for industrial jobs. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union, ending the office itself. That evening, the Soviet flag came down over the Kremlin for the last time. On March 27, 1964, the Great Alaska Earthquake struck at magnitude 9.2 and became the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in United States history. The shaking lasted about 4.5 minutes, long enough to leave houses perched above torn ground like this one. On October 17, 1941, USS Kearney was hit in the North Atlantic while the United States was still officially outside the war, and 11 Americans were lost while 22 were wounded. The destroyer survived the strike and reached Reykjavik on the 19th of October. In late August 1918, this single frame captured a sea of German prisoners taken near Amiens during the Allied advance. Less than 3 months later, the armistice of November 11, 1918, ended the fighting. On December 15, 1973, the American Psychiatric Association voted 13-0 to remove homosexuality from its official list of mental disorders. The decision changed psychiatric history and ended a label that had shaped medical thinking for decades. On October 20, 1926, United States Marines were ordered to guard the mail after a wave of armed robberies on railway routes. More than 2,500 Marines took part in the mission, turning mail trains into military-guarded targets. On March 21, 1962, Yogi the Bear became the first living creature ejected at supersonic speed during a United States Air Force test of the B-58 escape capsule. He came down alive after launch from 35,000 feet at about 870 miles per hour. On October 19, 1950, United Nations forces entered Pyongyang during the Korean War. The advance looked decisive, but Chinese forces entered the war weeks later and changed everything. In 1918, German soldiers stood in Kiev during the short occupation that followed the collapse of the Russian Empire. German forces entered the city in March 1918 and were gone by the end of the year. In 1942, at Tatsinskaya near Stalingrad, Heinkel, He-111 crews staged a symbolic funeral beside a burning coffin before their next flight. The photo was taken during the Stalingrad campaign, when this airfield was used for German air operations. A German non-commissioned officer holds a miniature Ferdinand tank destroyer built for him by men in his unit. The real Ferdinand weighed about 65 tons, which makes this hand-made model even stranger. In Karelia in 1944, a German soldier speaks with a Soviet prisoner still wearing an SN-42 steel breastplate. The armor was made for assault troops, weighed about 3.5 kilograms, and was never common on the front. In 1945, the only Messerschmitt P-1101 prototype sat unfinished in Germany as one of the strangest late war jet projects. It never flew, but its variable wing idea later helped inspire the Bell X-5. In February 1943, Dutch volunteer Gerardus Muijman became the first non-German to receive the Knight's Cross after destroying 13 Soviet tanks near Lake Ladoga in one day. His wartime total reached 23 tanks. During the 1992 Los Angeles unrest, Korean-American shop owners took positions on rooftops after police pulled back from Koreatown. The image became iconic, but many businesses were still looted, and the neighborhood was not saved. Around 1917, women were helping build aircraft by pulling linen tight over wooden frames. Many early airplanes were literally cloth-covered machines, with wings and fuselages finished in fabric instead of metal. Mad Jack Churchill landed with British commandos in Norway in 1941, carrying bagpipes and a sword, which made him one of the strangest officers of World War II. Captured in 1944, he later escaped from a German camp and walked about 200 kilometers before reaching Allied lines. In 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower broke down before a crowd of veterans while remembering the men lost on D-Day. The man who led the invasion still could not speak about it without tears 8 years later. In 1942, sailors on a United States Navy cruiser lined up to receive their pay in cash, one man at a time. Even during wartime, the ship still stopped for this quiet ritual of folded bills, paper lists, and long waiting lines. In November 1961, Richard Nixon stood on his roof in Los Angeles with a hose as the Brentwood Bel Air fire pushed toward nearby homes. The fire burned more than 6,000 acres and forced one future president into the same fight as his neighbors. When United States forces reached Dachau in April 1945, prisoners raised an American flag to greet the men entering the camp. The liberation came on April 29, 1945, turning this crowd into one of the clearest final images of Nazi rule collapsing. In 1945, Times Square filled with massive crowds celebrating Japan's surrender and the end of World War II. The scene became one of the most famous VJ Day images in the United States. In August 1968, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago spilled into the streets as police and demonstrators confronted each other in front of live cameras. The unrest lasted several nights and was broadcast across the United States. At Khe Sanh on February 21, 1968, a United States Marine wore a handwritten warning on his vest that said, "Being a Marine, there could be hazardous to your health." The Khe Sanh combat base was under siege for 77 days in 1968. In May 1945, 3 United States Marines of the 6th Marine Division bathed in a rain-filled crater during the Battle of Okinawa. The battle lasted from April 1 to June 22, 1945, and became the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. On April 20, 1945, American soldiers posed in Nuremberg on Adolf Hitler's final birthday. Germany surrendered 18 days later on the 8th of May, 1945. On February 28, 1940 in Tucson, representatives of Navajo, Papago, Apache, and Hopi communities signed a public pledge to stop using the swastika in traditional designs. They gave up an ancient symbol used long before Nazism. In 1952, Jacques Leonard moved from Paris to Montjuic and married into Barcelona's Romani community, giving him rare access to a world few outsiders could photograph. His images became one of the richest visual records of Romani life in Spain. In 1981, David Bowie and Mick Jagger carried the wedding cake at Eric Idle and Tanya Kosovich's reception. The photo puts two rock stars and a Monty Python founder in one rare private moment. In 1955, Sophia Loren kissed her younger sister, Anna Maria Vianney Ciccolone, in a rare private photo. Both grew up near Naples before Loren became one of Italy's biggest film stars. In 1972, Sammy Davis Jr. performed at Long Binh for 15,000 servicemen during his Vietnam tour. After the show, he said it was the most tired and the best he had ever felt. In 1906, Princess Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg and King Alfonso XIII posed during their engagement, linking the British and Spanish royal families. She was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria and became Queen of Spain later that same year. Christine Chubbuck was a 29-year-old television news anchor in Florida when this photo was taken in 1974. On July 15, 1974, her live broadcast ended in her death, making it one of the most infamous moments in television history. Major Sullivan Ballou wrote his famous farewell letter to his wife Sarah on July 14, 1861, just days before the First Battle of Bull Run. He died there on July 21 at age 32, and the letter later became one of the most quoted writings of the American Civil War. On Motobu Peninsula, in 1945, United States Marines found a Japanese Army truck with its star mark still visible on the door. Chains wrapped around the rear wheels hint at the rough Okinawa roads it was meant to cross. In 1939, a farm family in Sheridan County, Kansas, posed at home in a clear snapshot of rural thrift. The three girls wear dresses their mother made from flour sacks, a common way families turned food bags into clothing during hard years. In 1968, Dick Fosbury cleared the bar in Mexico City with a backward style that looked wrong and changed high jump forever. He won Olympic gold and turned the Fosbury flop into the new world standard. On June 12, 1966, crowds at 66th Street and 5th Avenue waved Puerto Rican and United States flags during the Puerto Rican Day Parade in Manhattan. By the 1960s, New York had become home to the largest Puerto Rican community outside Puerto Rico. In the 1960s, young women posed in short skirts, patterned blouses, knee socks, and thick platform shoes that defined the new youth look. The sharp change from the heavy styles of earlier decades made this one of the most recognizable fashion shifts of the 20th century. On April 9, 1938 in Tunis, women joined mass protests against French protectorate rule and demanded political reform. The demonstrations became a major turning point on the road to Tunisian independence. In April 1945 on Okinawa, United States Marines fought room by room through shattered concrete as they tried to break Japanese defense lines. The battle lasted 82 days and became the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War. In 1992, Fernando Collor de Mello walked away from Brazil's presidency as the impeachment crisis closed in around him. He had taken office in 1990, and his sudden fall became one of the biggest political shocks in modern Brazil. On December 16, 1971 in Dhaka, children rushed into the street celebrating the ceasefire that opened the way for Bangladesh to become independent. That same day, Pakistani forces in East Pakistan surrendered, ending the war in 13 days. On Okinawa in 1945, United States Marines found 11 civilians hiding in a hillside cave after a baby's crying revealed the shelter. After they were assured they were safe, the group came out, and one Marine helped the mother and child. On July 1, 1944, United States Marines held a rough front-line position on Saipan during one of the hardest island battles of the Pacific War. Saipan fell later that month, and its airfield soon gave American B-29 bombers a direct path to Japan. During a weapon test, a North American B-25 Mitchell lights up the air with flashes from its forward guns. The B-25 became one of the most widely used American medium bombers of World War II. Jan Kubis and Josef Gabčík were the Czech and Slovak soldiers behind Operation Anthropoid, the 1942 attack on Reinhard Heydrich. The mission became one of the most famous resistance actions in occupied Europe. In Oslo in 1940, a shop window displayed the message, "Palestina calls." Jews are not tolerated in Norway, making anti-Jewish exclusion visible on an ordinary street. Germany occupied Norway from April 1940, and signs like this showed how fast that hatred entered daily life. At Khe Sanh in 1968, a United States Marine uses an M2.50 caliber gun fitted with an optic near the base perimeter. The siege of Khe Sanh lasted 77 days and became one of the most famous battles of the Vietnam War. Jan Kubis and Josef Gabčík were the Czech and Slovak soldiers behind Operation Anthropoid, the 1942 attack on Reinhard Heydrich. It became one of the most famous resistance missions in occupied Europe. In December 1989, armored vehicles stood in Bucharest as Romania's communist regime collapsed. The uprising began in Timișoara on December 16th, reached Bucharest by the 21st of December, and the cutout flag became one of its clearest symbols. Heinz Rheineffarth was an SS commander tied to the Wola massacre in Warsaw in August 1944, where German forces killed tens of thousands of Polish civilians in days. After the war, he became a politician in West Germany and died in 1979 without ever being convicted for it. In May 1945, ethnic German civilians in Czechoslovakia were rounded up at the Borislavka cinema during the chaotic reprisals that followed Germany's collapse. For many Sudeten Germans, the war ended not with peace, but with detention, forced marches, and expulsion. In 1930, members of the Delta chapter of Alpha Kappa Alpha posed at the University of Kansas in a rare image of black college life between the wars. Alpha Kappa Alpha had been founded in 1908, making it the first black sorority in the United States. Richard and Mildred Loving were forced out of Virginia after their 1958 marriage because the state banned interracial marriage. In 1967, Loving versus Virginia struck down those laws across the United States. In March 1945, American infantry in Cologne took cover as a phosphorus shell burst in the ruined street behind them. The battle for Cologne ended that same month after street fighting turned much of the city center into rubble. In the 1890s, long wagon teams crossed Death Valley hauling borax out of one of the harshest working landscapes in North America. Some of the famous borax trains pulled loads of more than 30 tons. This 1980s family photo shows Saddam Hussein with his first wife, Sajida Talfa, their children, and his sons, Udi and Qusay. What looks like an ordinary home portrait later became a rare image of one of the most feared ruling families in Iraq. In Gudermez in 1999, Chechen boys leaned toward a Russian soldier during the Second Chechen War. Russian forces took Gudermez in December 1999 after weeks of fighting. In the 1940s and 1950s, black Jewish communities in Harlem built congregations that challenged the idea that Jewish life in New York had only one face. In 1945, General George S. Patton Jr.'s coffin was carried through Luxembourg City Station on the way to his burial. His last wish was not West Point, but a grave beside the soldiers he had led in Europe. In 1881, a rare photo of Bavaria's king seated beside Austrian actor Joseph Kainz caused a scandal across court circles. The king was removed from power in 1886 and died 3 days later. In August 1944, a young Polish Home Army fighter posed at the start of the Warsaw Uprising with a captured submachine gun slung over his shoulder. The revolt lasted 63 days, and Warsaw was left in ruins after it was defeated. In 1945, a joint rescue force of United States troops, air crews, and Filipino guerrillas struck the Los Banos camp in the Philippines and freed 2,147 prisoners. The ground assault lasted only minutes and became one of the most successful rescue missions of the Pacific War. In 1943, film star Jean Gabin left fame behind and joined the Free French Forces to serve in uniform. He later fought with Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division, turning one of France's biggest screen icons into a real wartime soldier. 15-year-old Mabel Mayer appears calm in this 1927 photo, but her name soon became part of one of Oakland's most haunting cases. On July 2, 1927, she left her uncle's home for the 10 o'clock night train and never reached the Blanche Street station where her brother was waiting. German soldiers are lifted above a cheering crowd in Tallinn in August 1941 after Soviet forces lost the Estonian capital. Many locals first saw the entry as liberation from the 1940 Soviet takeover, but German rule began almost at once. In 1943, doctors from 12 countries joined a German-backed Katyn Commission to determine when the Polish victims had died. The commission concluded that the deaths took place in spring 1940 and held the Soviet Union responsible. A woman holds a small child outside a worn farm home in Oneida County, Idaho in 1936, in land hit by Dust Bowl conditions. The drought of the 1930s reached this western county too, showing that the crisis spread far beyond the famous Plains states. Ante Pavelic, former head of the wartime independent state of Croatia, is seen recovering in Argentina in 1957 after a revenge attack by Blagoje Jovovic. Jovovic said he targeted Pavelic over the mass crimes against Serbs carried out under his rule from 1941 to 1945. Lithuanian rebels carry a removed portrait of Joseph Stalin during the June 1941 revolt against Soviet rule. The uprising began as Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and Lithuanian activists briefly took control of many towns before German occupation replaced Soviet power. On Christmas Day, 1944, in San Jose, Mindoro, a wounded American sergeant feeds his wounded friend inside a field shelter. The photo was taken during the Mindoro campaign, only days after United States forces landed on the island in December 1944. Russian émigrés and Japanese officers pose in Harbin, Manchuria, in 1934 at a banquet of the All-Russian Fascist Party. The movement was built by white Russian exiles under Japanese control and openly modeled itself on the rising far-right politics of Europe. These men were photographed at Buchenwald on April 11, 1945, after prisoners rose up and took control of the camp before United States troops arrived. About 21,000 people were still inside when the camp was liberated that day. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg are seen in federal court in New York on April 5, 1951, the day their case reached its most dramatic moment. They became the only civilians in United States history sentenced to death for conspiracy to pass atomic bomb secrets to the Soviet Union. Adolf Hitler sits with the first cabinet sworn in on January 30, 1933, a government that looked less radical than many expected. Only 3 of the 11 ministers were Nazis, and conservative allies believed they could control him. The upper frame captures prisoners leaving Auschwitz after liberation on January 27, 1945, while the lower frame shows the same gate decades later in winter silence. When Soviet troops arrived, about 7,000 sick and starving prisoners were still alive inside. A Soviet soldier waves a red flag over ruined Stalingrad, where block after block had been smashed into ice and rubble. The fighting ended on February 2, 1943, and the German surrender there became one of the biggest turning points of the entire war. Israeli troops moved people during the Malat school crisis on May 15, 1974, after armed Palestinian attackers seized a school in northern Israel. The attack ended with 28 deaths, including 22 children. A North Vietnamese tank enters Saigon on April 30, 1975, the day South Vietnam fell. By the end of that day, the city was under North Vietnamese control, and the war was over. Stand Watie, born on December 12, 1806, became the only Native American to reach the rank of Major General in the American Civil War. He was also the last Confederate field commander to surrender, holding out until June 1865. On May 18, 1944, Crimean Tatar children stand in line after Stalin ordered the mass deportation of their people from Crimea. More than 230,000 were sent to Central Asia, and later estimates say up to 46% did not survive the aftermath. On April 24, 1915, Ottoman authorities arrested about 250 Armenian intellectuals in Constantinople, a step widely seen as the start of the Armenian genocide. Many were later deported or did not survive, and Turkey still rejects the genocide label. On January 27, 1944, people in Leningrad embraced Red Army soldiers as the 872-day siege was finally broken. Exactly 1 year later, on January 27, 1945, Soviet troops reached Auschwitz and found about 7,000 prisoners still alive. On January 27, 1945, Red Army troops liberated Auschwitz-Birkenau near the Polish town of Oswiecim, exposing the largest Nazi camp complex. About 7,000 prisoners were still alive there when Soviet forces arrived. Residents of besieged Leningrad clear a snow-covered street as the city struggles through the winter of 1941. The blockade lasted 872 days, from September 1941 to January 1944, and more than 1 million civilians did not survive it. Chicago police swing clubs at unarmed steelworkers and their families during the Memorial Day Massacre in 1937. The attack left 10 people dead, and officials later blocked local screenings of the film footage. This damaged Israeli school bus was photographed on May 22, 1970, after the Avivim school bus attack near the Lebanon border. The strike killed 12 people, including 9 children aged 7 to 10, and became one of the deadliest school bus attacks in Israeli history. Israeli soldiers gather beside a flag in Jerusalem on June 10, 1967, as the Six-Day War came to its final hours. In 6 days, Israel captured East Jerusalem, the West Bank, Gaza, Sinai, and the Golan Heights. Polish Home Army fighters fire from a barricade during the Warsaw Uprising, which began on August 1, 1944, as the city tried to break free before Soviet forces arrived. The uprising lasted 63 days, and after it failed, German forces destroyed much of Warsaw. James Collip, seen here in 1922, helped turn insulin from a lab discovery into the first life-saving treatment for diabetes. On the 11th January 1922, 14-year-old Leonard Thompson became the first person to receive insulin at Toronto General Hospital. Harriet Quimby became the first woman to earn a pilot license in the United States in 1911, when flight itself was still new and risky. In 1912, she became the first woman to fly across the English Channel. Marie Sklodowska-Curie and Pierre Curie are seen in the years when they announced the discovery of radium on December 26, 1898. To isolate tiny amounts of it, they processed huge loads of pitch blende residue in a simple lab. Raised fists appear through the bars after the Rivonia trial on the 12th of June, 1964, when Nelson Mandela and 7 others were sentenced to life in prison. Mandela spent 27 years behind bars before becoming South Africa's first black president in 1994. On the 6th of March, 1940, Simo Haiha survived a bullet to the jaw in the final days of the Winter War. Before he lost consciousness, he still managed to fire back at the Soviet soldier who hit him. An armed man crouches behind rubble in Beirut on the 13th of April, 1975, as Lebanon slides into a war that would break the country for 15 years. By 1990, the conflict had caused about 150,000 deaths and pushed nearly 1 million people from their homes. Edith Frank, born on January 16, 1900, was Anne Frank's mother and the quiet center of the family, later hidden in Amsterdam. After their arrest in 1944, she was sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau and died there in January 1945 from illness and exhaustion. On May 25, 1926, Samuel Schwarzbard killed Simon Petlura in Paris after first confirming his identity in Ukrainian. At trial, he said he was avenging relatives lost in the anti-Jewish pogroms linked to Petlura, and a French jury acquitted him. A mother and child hold a newspaper outside the Supreme Court on May 17, 1954, the day Brown versus Board of Education changed American schools. The unanimous ruling said segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. Theodore Bundy is led by officers in Florida on January 24, 1989, hours before one of the most watched final sentences in American history. He later admitted to many attacks on young women between 1974 and 1978, and the state carried out his sentence that morning. In Kyiv, on 24 May 1964, a nighttime fire left the Ukrainian Studies Department of the State Library in ruins. About 500,000 to 600,000 books and manuscripts were lost, including rare material on Ukraine's early history. This damaged apartment block in Kiryat Shmona was photographed after attackers crossed from Lebanon on April 11, 1974, during Passover. The assault killed 18 Israelis, including 8 children, before the standoff ended inside the building. This bus was photographed after the 1954 Mal Akrabim ambush, when armed attackers struck an Israeli route through the Negev desert. 12 passengers, including women and children, did not survive, and the attack became one of the earliest mass civilian tragedies in Israel's history. Flossenburg concentration camp was liberated on April 23, 1945, but only about 2,500 prisoners were still inside when United States forces arrived. In the final days before liberation, thousands more had already been forced out on brutal marches. John F. Kennedy sits before a wall of cameras in the White House on October 22, 1962, as he tells Americans that Soviet missile sites have been found in Cuba. The speech began the 13-day Cuban Missile Crisis, which ended only after a United States-Soviet deal on October 28, 1962. Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, and D.W. Griffith launched United Artists on February 5, 1919, to control their own films instead of relying on the big studios. It became one of the boldest power moves in early Hollywood. On September 15, 1896, about 40,000 people gathered in Crush, Texas, to watch 2 locomotives smash into each other in a railroad publicity stunt. Instead, both boilers burst, metal flew into the crowd. 2 people did not survive. German troops march into Paris on June 14, 1940, moving past the Arc de Triomphe as the French capital falls to Germany. France signed an armistice on June 22, 1940, and Paris remained under German control for more than 4 years. Rudolph Valentino poses with his dog in the 1920s, only a short time before his death in New York on August 23, 1926, at age 31. More than 100,000 mourners lined Manhattan streets for his funeral. Broadway filled with flags and improvised ticker tape on May 8, 1945, as New York erupted for victory in Europe Day. Germany had surrendered the day before, ending the war in Europe, while fighting in the Pacific still continued. On April 1, 1957, Panorama aired the famous spaghetti tree prank, showing Swiss women picking strands of spaghetti from branches. So many viewers believed it that the broadcaster received calls asking how to grow their own spaghetti tree. Alexander Lukashenko stands beside Belarus's new red and green state flag in June 1995, after the country dropped the white-red-white banner adopted in 1991. The change followed a disputed referendum that brought back Soviet-style state symbols. At an official Flag Day celebration in 1914, the United States President sits on stage beneath a row of flags as Washington gathers around him. On the same platform are Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. A late 1800s portrait from Jerusalem captures a Bedouin man in layered dress with a curved dagger at his belt. Images like this became part of one of the richest photo archives of the Middle East before the modern era. An Andaman Islander works by hand with cord or a simple tool in this 1890s portrait, capturing a daily skill with striking detail. Images like this became some of the earliest visual records of Andaman life made by photographers from outside the islands. Franco of Spain and Salazar of Portugal leave Santiago de Compostela Cathedral in 1950 under guard. Both dictators kept their countries officially neutral in the Second World War and outlasted most of Europe's other far-right regimes. Charles de Gaulle shakes hands with a young boy in the 1940s, a rare soft moment from the leader of Free France. After France fell in 1940, he built a rival movement from exile and became the face of French resistance. A soldadera stands with her rifle beside a train in Mexico in 1914, wrapped in bandoliers and ready to move with the army. Women like her were vital to the Mexican Revolution, carrying supplies, caring for troops, and sometimes fighting themselves. Philippe de Gaulle, son of Charles de Gaulle, reads the Order of the Day in Normandy in 1944 while serving with the 2nd Armored Division. He was not just the general's son, but an active officer in the force that helped free France. These 1867 portraits from Yangon show Mafun and his son, both with a rare condition that caused heavy facial hair growth. The images became one of the earliest photo records of this condition in Asia. A woman in Sarajevo in 1912 shows the tattoo patterns once worn by many Catholic women in Bosnia. The custom lasted for generations and was linked to identity under Ottoman rule. A packed Stamford Bridge crowd watches Chelsea play Sheffield Wednesday on April 10, 1926. The league match ended 0-0. A young woman from the Kimchiashvili family stands in a bride's dress in Soviet Ajara in the 1920s. Her tall, wrapped veil preserves a local wedding style from the Caucasus at the start of the Soviet era. United States General William Simpson awards the Legion of Merit to Soviet General Alexander Gorbatov during the Allied link-up in 1945. The photo captures a rare public moment of honor between American and Soviet commanders near the end of the war. Fidel Castro sits with Yuri Gagarin and Che Guevara in Cuba in 1961, bringing 3 Cold War icons into one frame. Gagarin had become the first human in space that same year, turning his visit into a global event. Taken at Ellis Island between 1906 and 1914, this portrait captures an immigrant in full traditional dress with a dagger at his belt. Augustus Sherman turned arrivals like him into one of the clearest photo records of people entering the United States in the early 1900s. This prison portrait shows a Polish community leader about 3 weeks before he was killed at Auschwitz. His daughter survived the Holocaust, was adopted by her older sister, and reached America in the late 1940s. Linda stands with Governor DuPont in 1977 after becoming the first black woman to complete Delaware's Army National Guard Officer Candidate School. She earned her Signal Officer diploma in 1978. Women make protest signs for abortion rights in the late 1960s under a bold women's liberation banner. Their message was clear and new for its time. Women wanted control over their own bodies and choices. A mother holds her youngest child in Tennessee in 1936, wearing a skirt made from a flour sack. Carl Meidens found her family of 9 living in a crude shelter built on a Ford chassis in a field near United States Route 70. Friedrich Paulus appears here shortly before surrendering at Stalingrad in January 1943, the battle that broke Germany's 6th Army. Hitler made him a field marshal the day before because no German field marshal had ever surrendered, but Paulus gave up anyway. Charles de Gaulle sits with his daughter Anne, whose photo he reportedly kept close for years. During the 1962 attack on his motorcade, later accounts said one shot was stopped by a framed picture of Anne. The Marine Corps War Memorial is unveiled in Arlington County, Virginia, on November 10, 1954, with Washington in the background. It honors United States Marines who died in service from 1775 onward. United States troops detained Grenadians beside an armored vehicle during the invasion of Grenada on October 25, 1983. The operation overthrew the island's military government in days and became the first major United States combat action after Vietnam. The Führer bunker lay beneath the Reich Chancellery grounds in Berlin, where Adolf Hitler moved on the 16th of January 1945 as Germany collapsed. He remained there through the final battle for the city and died there on the 30th of April, 1945. United States Marines fire from a sandbagged position at Khe Sanh on January 21, 1968, as one of the Vietnam War's most watched battles begins. The siege lasted 77 days and became a symbol of how costly and contested the war had become. Buffalo Bill Cody stands in costume in 1872, the year he made his first stage appearance in Chicago in The Scouts of the Prairie. That debut launched the public career that later made him one of the most famous showmen in the United States. Cars pull into Chicago's Exchange National Bank on November 12, 1946, for the first drive in banking service in the United States. It opened with 10 teller windows and let customers do their banking without leaving the car. On December 22, 1837, Congress authorized federal help for sailors in distress, one of the first steps toward organized United States sea rescue. Later, surfboat crews like the one seen here became the front line of that life-saving mission. I will be very grateful for your subscription to the channel. Every day I try to tell you about such interesting historical photos.